Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Office for Human Research Protection's webinar series on the Common Rule. Today's webinar, Respecting Persons, From Basic Requirements to Embracing Participant-Centered Informed Consent, will be presented to you by Public Health Program Specialist Mariana Azar. This webinar will be recorded and will run for a total of 60 minutes, including a live Q&A session. If you have questions, please submit them through the chat. Certificates of attendance will be issued to all who have registered. The slides will be available on OHRP's website under the past events section soon, as well as the recording. We will go ahead and get started.
Thank you so much, Sina. All right, so I'm going to start us off with our standard disclaimer. I may express opinions in this presentation. They are my own and do not necessarily reflect the policies of the Department of Health and Human Services or OHRP. There are also several regulatory concepts that are going to be discussed in this presentation. For a complete and accurate description of the regulatory requirements, please be sure to refer to the text of the revised Common Rule, which is available on OHRP's website. Our learning objectives for today are to review the ethical principle of respect for persons and the fundamentals of personal autonomy as they relate to the notion of voluntary and informed participation in research, discuss the Common Rule regulatory requirements for informed consent for research involving human subjects, and talk about strategies that we can use to ensure participant-centered informed consent documents and discussions. And let's start with the ethics. And more specifically, let's start with the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Now, in the 18th century, many philosophers linked morality to God and religion. But in contrast, Immanuel Kant framed morality in terms of categorical imperatives, which are commands that one must follow regardless of one's desires. For Kant, categorical imperatives were moral obligations that are derived from pure reason. So it doesn't matter if you want to be moral or immoral, the moral law is binding on all of us. And we all know what's right and what's wrong just by using our intellect. So what does that actually mean? How do you figure out what's moral? Well, Kant came up with 4 formulations of what he referred to as categorical imperatives. And for our purposes, let's look at one of these 4 formulations, which is focused on how we should treat other people. And it goes like this. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of another, always as an end and never as a mere means. And what does that even mean? Well, for Kant, to use something as a mere means is to use it only for your own benefit, with no thought to the interest or benefit of the thing that you're using. Of course, we use things as mere means all the time. I'm using this computer to deliver this presentation, and if it stops working and stops benefiting me, I will stop using it and ask the federal government to give me another laptop from the early 2000s. It's okay for me to use objects as mere means, but according to Kant, it is never okay to use human beings this way. And the reason for this is because humans are, quote unquote, ends in themselves. What this means is that human beings are not mere objects that exist to be used by others. Humans do not serve a utility like a computer. They exist for themselves and are an end in themselves. So to treat someone as an end in themselves is to recognize their humanity and to acknowledge that they have goals, values, and interests of their own. Of course, we do use people all the time, and that's okay too, because usually we use people as a means for something. So again, for example, I can call my plumber and I can use her expertise to fix my kitchen sink, but I'm not using her as a mere means in this interaction. I recognize her humanity when I use her expertise, and she agrees to being used for her expertise in exchange for payment. Kant argued that all human beings deserve not to be used as a mere means because of our personal autonomy or our self-governance. Human beings are, again, rational creatures. They can set their own ends. They can make their own free decisions based on their rational wills. They can also set goals for themselves, and they can take steps to realize these goals. And this, for Kant, is what gives human beings their absolute moral worth. Okay, so if we follow Kant's argument, why does research with human beings present an inherent ethical tension? Well, to start, how do we define research? Research, at least as it is defined by the Common Rule regulatory requirements, is a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Research is about promoting the common rather than the individual good. Research also requires human subjects or living human beings, which means that in research, human beings are used as a means to achieve the goal of promoting the common good, which is in conflict with the imperative that we treat human beings as an end. So Kant would not be happy about this. So what's a solution to the ethical tension that's posed by research with human subjects? Well, the Belmont Report, which was published in 1976 by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, outlined basic ethical principles and also offered guidelines that address the ethical issues that arise from the conduct of research with human subjects. Among them is the ethical principle of respect for persons, which requires us to acknowledge personal autonomy and to further protect those with diminished autonomy. And so, in keeping with Kant's categorical imperative, the Belmont Report described an autonomous person as an individual that is capable of deliberation about personal goals and of acting under the direction of these deliberations. So, to respect autonomy is to give weight to an autonomous person's considered opinions and choices, while also refraining from obstructing their actions, unless, of course, these actions could be detrimental to others. And not everyone is autonomous at all points of one's life. So the capacity for self-determination matures during one's lifetime. And some individuals lose this capacity either wholly or in part because of illness, mental disability, or circumstances that restrict liberty. So respect for the not fully mature or the not fully autonomous, as well as those that are otherwise incapacitated, may require protecting them as they mature or while they are incapacitated. Again, all of this is done for the purposes of respecting their inherent personal autonomy. So for cases of research involving human subjects, respect for persons demands that individuals enter research voluntarily, that they decide for themselves in accordance with their own values about their research participation. It also demands that research subjects be provided with adequate information to make an informed decision about their research participation. Now, the Belmont Report not only articulated ethical principles, it also outlined how they can be applied to human subjects research. For instance, the Belmont Report stipulated that respect for persons requires that research subjects, at least to the degree that they are capable, be given the opportunity to choose what shall or shall not happen to them. This opportunity is provided when adequate standards for informed consent are satisfied. And Belmont articulates three elements that are essential to informed consent, which are information, comprehension, and voluntariness. Now, information means disclosures that are intended to assure the research subject is given sufficient information about things like the research procedures, their purpose, the risks and the anticipated benefits, alternative procedures when therapy might be involved, and a statement offering the subject the opportunity to ask questions and to withdraw from the research at any time. Comprehension refers to the importance of the manner and the context in which information is conveyed. For example, Belmont states that presenting information in a disorganized and a rapid fashion, allowing too little time for consideration, or otherwise curtailing opportunities for questioning, may all adversely affect the subject's ability to make an informed choice about research participation. Belmont also outlined the importance of promoting voluntariness because an agreement to participate in research constitutes a valid consent only if it is voluntarily given. This means that informed consent must be given under conditions that are otherwise free of coercion and undue influence. So if I were to summarize all of this quite crudely, the way to bridge the ethical tension posed by using human beings as a means in human subjects research is to ensure that their involvement in research is both voluntary and informed. Okay, and so with the ethics under our belt, let's look at how this is all put into action in the common rule regulatory requirements. Now, note that the requirements for informed consent that are outlined in subpart A of the regulations at 45 CFR 46 apply to non-exempt human subjects research that is funded or supported by the Department of Health and Human Services. There are also 3 additional subparts, B, C, and D, that outline additional protections and informed consent requirements for vulnerable populations. Now, this presentation is not going to cover these subparts or the requirements that are detailed in them. And if you have no idea what I just said, I point you to the 3 common rule basic webinars that are posted on the OHRP website for additional background information. Okay, so having said that, note that the regulations do specify the general requirements for informed consent. This includes basic standards for information, comprehensibility, and voluntariness. They also outline 9 basic elements of informed consent that must, if it is applicable, appear in all consent documents, and 9 additional elements that must appear if they apply to the research at hand. The regulations also outline criteria under which a waiver or an alteration of these requirements may be sought and approved by an IRB. And I'm going to explain all of this in the slides that follow. Okay, so starting with the general requirements. So in keeping with the ethical principles that are articulated in the Belmont report, the general requirements for informed consent include the requirement that for investigators to obtain the legally effective consent of the research subject, or in the case of those whose autonomy or decision-making capacity may be compromised or diminished, the consent of the legally authorized representative. Consent must also be sought under circumstances that provide sufficient opportunity to discuss and consider if one wants to participate or not participate in the research, and under circumstances that minimize the possibility of coercion or undue influence. Also in keeping with the Belmont report, the regulations stipulate that information be provided in understandable language. Now, quite recently, the regulations were also revised to include the requirement that consent documents provide information that a quote unquote reasonable person would want to have to make an informed decision about whether or not to participate in research. This reasonable person standard is something that you may be familiar with as a legal standard. In clinical research, the standard is applied to considerations regarding the type of disclosures about a research study that ordinary people would want and need to know to make an informed decision about their participation. Likewise, the regulations were also revised to require that consent documents begin with quote unquote key information, which is information that is most likely to assist a prospective research participant / reasonable person understand the reasons for why they might or might not want to participate in a given research study. This provision also requires that the beginning portion of the informed consent document be organized and presented in a way that facilitates comprehension. This is to say that information should not be provided as a list of isolated facts, but rather it should be weaved together in a way that facilitates understanding of reasons for participation or non-participation. Lastly, there's also the requirement that informed consent not include exculpatory language, which is otherwise language through which the subject or their legally authorized representative is made to waive or appear to waive any of the subject's legal rights, or that releases, or at least appears to release, the investigator, the sponsor, the institution, or its agents from liability for negligence. Now, before we go any further, I do want to say a little bit more about the requirement for key information, for the key information section in the informed consent document. Now, it was noted in recommendations issued by the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Human Research Protections, or SACRP, as you see here, that the key information section is essentially a summary. It is also an opportunity to orient, to guide, and to assist potential subjects in the decision-making process. All of this is to say that it's not a summary of the full protocol. It does not need to include all of the required elements of consent, and it is not the entire consent form pushed together into a box at the start of the document and then repeated again throughout the body. The key information is information that is presented first versus dispersed throughout the document for the prospective participant to stumble upon haphazardly. So it should include the information that is most crucial to a participant's considered decision about whether or not to participate in research. And this can be both general information, or it could be very specific details that may influence decision making. The other thing to note about key information is that it's always going to be study specific, and we'll say quite a bit more about this throughout this presentation. Okay, so I mentioned basic elements of informed consent. Now, I'm not going to go over these individually. You have the list in front of you, but I do want to make the following point regarding the required basic elements. Now, in keeping with the ethical principle of respect for person, as well as the regulatory requirements for the reasonable person standard, key information, and the requirement that information be provided in a way that actually facilitates understanding, the aim is to communicate these basic elements not as a list of isolated and unrelated facts, nor should you think of these basic elements as a template that should be filled out. The way to think about the basic elements is as information that will be received and understood by the prospective research participant in a way that makes sense to them, and in a way that will allow them to use this information to make a personal decision about research participation from the perspective of their values, their desires, their needs, and their preferences. In other words, researchers and others who are responsible for developing consent documents or reviewing consent documents should consider how to present this information so that it does not amount to a list with these items detailed under a category: risks, benefits, alternatives to participation. What you need to think about is the way that this information will be understood by the prospective research participant and weave it into a coherent and clear narrative to facilitate that understanding. Now, similar to the basic elements, there are also these additional elements, which again, I'm not going to go through one by one, but they must be included when they are applicable to the research or appropriate to the research. And again, everything that I just said about the way that we should communicate the basic elements would apply to these additional elements as well. Okay, so how do we do all of this? I mean, this just seems like a list of isolated facts that don't make sense together. Well, for starters, the participants or their legally authorized representatives must be provided with a copy, and note that this can be either a paper or an electronic copy of the consent document. And again, in keeping with Belmont, they must also be given sufficient opportunity to discuss and consider the invitation to participate in research. And on this point, I want to stop for a minute and really underline this requirement because it is quite often missed both by researchers and by IRBs reviewing their studies. What this requirement says is that you really need to think about what it means to provide sufficient opportunity to consider research participation when developing or reviewing research proposals. I can't tell you from personal experience how many studies I've reviewed that either glossed over these details entirely in the submitted protocol for IRB consideration, or that would merely say, that sufficient opportunity would be provided, but not offer any of the logistical details to support this claim. If you have a subject coming to the clinic once and the aim is to invite them to participate in the research during their sole visit for clinical, for non-research participation purposes, think about more deeply about what it means to give them sufficient opportunity to consider the research invitation if that invitation is going to be made during that single visit. These are the kind of logistical details that further your support for respect for persons. Now, unrelated to this, unless the requirement is waived, participants must also sign the consent document before their participation in the study. And this signature can be either electronic or it can be on paper. It can be electronic, however, if it is legally valid within the jurisdiction where the research is being conducted. So that is to say that you really need to check the local laws and the state laws before seeking and obtaining an electronic signature for research participation. Now, is consent always required? No. Consent is not always required. Investigators can request a waiver or an alteration of the elements of informed consent, and don't conflate those two. An outright waiver is different from an alteration of some of the elements for informed consent. Now, in order to approve this request, the IRB must find and document that the research, one, presents no more than minimal risk to subjects, two, could not practically be carried out without the waiver, three, if the research involves identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens, that it could not practically be carried out otherwise without using these materials in an identifiable format. This is a new addition with the revised common rule, so take note of it if you have not noticed it in the past couple of years. Four, that the research will not adversely affect the rights and welfare of the subjects. And five, that whenever appropriate, the subjects will be debriefed. Now, remember, informed consent is how we operationalize our respect for persons and mitigate the inherent tension that is posed by research with human subjects. So from this perspective, the requirements for waiving or altering the elements of informed consent are meant to reflect the types of circumstances and conditions that could make it ethically permissible for us to waive or alter these basic requirements. What about signatures? I talked about getting either a paper or an electronic signature. Does the subject always have to sign the consent document? No. Obtaining the subject's signature can be waived if, one, the consent form is the only document that links the subject to the research, and the principal risk of harm from the research is a breach of confidentiality. Now, this is to say that the risk of harm from a breach of confidentiality is not among the many principal risks of the research. It is the principal risk. Or alternatively, the research poses no greater than minimal risk to subjects and involves only procedures that do not normally require written consent. Or the research poses no more than minimal risk and involves subjects who are members of a distinct community in which signing forms is not the norm and an alternative mechanism for documentation is available. And again, these are all determinations that must be made by an IRB. Okay, a few additional items that are worth noting. An IRB may approve a research proposal in which an investigator will obtain information or biospecimens for the purposes of screening, recruitment, or determinations of eligibility of prospective subjects without informed consent if either the information is obtained by either oral or written communication with the subject, or the information or biospecimens are obtained by accessing records or stored identifiable biospecimens. Now, be very careful to note the purpose for which consent can be waived under 116G. It is very explicitly limited to screening, recruitment, and eligibility procedures. Also, for something that meets the definition of a clinical trial, one IRB approved consent form that was used to enroll subjects must be posted to a designated publicly available website such as clinicaltrials.gov or regulations.gov after the trial is closed to recruitment. Now, for more on this requirement, you should check out the 2022 OHRP guidance for informed consent posting instructions. Now, as I said at the start of this presentation, this is by no means a complete overview of the regulatory requirements that pertain to informed consent. Please be sure to refer to the complete text of the Common Rule for a more complete overview of the regulatory requirements. And with that, I want to now take us to think about how we can couple the ethical commitment to respecting persons with the regulatory requirement for informed consent and move toward a consent process that centers the prospective research participant. Okay, and how can we get started? Well, A natural starting place is the common rule requirement that we focus on the informational needs of prospective research participants. After all, the purpose of informed consent is to give prospective participants an opportunity to obtain and understand the information that they need to make an informed decision about research participation. What this means is that informed consent should really empower individuals by giving them the relevant information. And if you follow that line of reasoning, you recognize that informed consent is not intended for disclaimers that shield researchers or their institutions from liabilities, nor is it a document that merely offers a list of isolated facts to satisfy the regulatory requirements. Okay, so having recognized that, how do you establish information that might be of relevance to a prospective research participant? Well, you can pay attention to who needs the information. You can ask what information they might need. And then you can consider how you could best understand this information and how they can best understand this information and make an informed and meaningful decision about their participation in research. Okay, so again, where do we start? Well, what if we start with the understanding that people are not generally familiar with the concept of research? If you start here, what baseline information should be communicated and how should basic concepts be explained? What about perspective? Researchers and their prospective participants are coming to the research from very different perspectives and positions. Researchers can explain why they want to do the research and what they hope to find out with the research. That's their context. But participants need to be told why they specifically are being asked to participate. So researchers need to find a way to bridge this divide by focusing on the participant's perspective and the ways in which they convey information to participants. This means that the information you provide and the words that you use is going to have a very significant impact and implications for your potential participants. Remember, inherently, biomedical, social, and health research involves scientific, medical, and other health concepts that are complex, they're unfamiliar, and they're potentially overwhelming, even for somebody who works in the field. To bridge the divide between researchers and prospective participants, we have to move from describing how science works to explaining how the study procedures could affect the participant. Ultimately, the decision to participate in the research is going to be a complex one, and it's going to be one of significance to the individual who is being asked to make this decision. And this individual is going to rely on researchers and the IRBs that they work with to give them the information that they need to make this complex decision. Okay, so how do you then convey this complex information in a way that's done successfully? Well, you can note that the context, the position, the starting place of the researcher versus the prospective subject is going to be different, and that context should shape the content of the information that is provided. Now, I've used this word context without really explaining it, so let me say what it means. Now, context is going to refer to the circumstances around and about an action or an activity. And it's going to provide the background or the big picture information that is needed to grasp why the action or activity is being proposed and what the person's relationship might be to that context or that situation. Without context, it is very easy to misinterpret a situation. So you need to consider the context and you need to use it to drive the content that you provide. So I'll give you an example. If you're explaining the purpose of a study, you can frame the content of this description to fit the participant's context. One way to do this is to present the information as a response to a question that a participant might naturally ask. For example, why am I being asked to participate? What would it mean for me if I participate or decide not to participate? And so on. Now, in responding to these questions, you need to remember that you need to highlight information that may be specifically of interest to the prospective participant of this specific study, right? So it's not a vague hypothetical participant. It's a very specific understanding of the type of participant that you might have for the kind of study that you're inviting them to participate in. For example, you're trying to communicate information about a phase 1 study that aims to examine the safety of a drug. what information might be uniquely of interest to the prospective participants of this type of research? Well, they might want to know that there are no health benefits to them, right? Because it's a phase 1 study. They'll want to know what is already known about this drug, and they'll probably be curious about the safety measures that are in place to monitor or minimize the risks that they might face as a result of ingesting this drug. Everything else, including the science and the high-level explanation for why this research is important, might not be the kind of content that is relevant in the context of a phase 1 study and a phase 1 study participant. Now, another way to think about this is the way that we generally communicate study risks. So it is not uncommon in a consent form to see risks communicated as a very long bulleted list without any qualifying information. But of course, providing context for the risks helps potential participants understand what risks are more important than others, specifically for them. So knowing the most common risk or the most serious risk and their individual likelihood would be helpful to decide if you want to participate in the study or not, right? Because this is the kind of crucial information that's going to drive your decision making. Remember, at the core, the goal of informed consent is to help someone make a meaningful decision for why they might or might not want to participate in research. And I know I've said that 50 times in the course of this presentation, but that's because that's really the key of this. So you need to be selective in the information that you provide, right? You need to limit the content that somebody doesn't need to know, such as detailed explanations of the science involved or other details that may actually be quite relevant to something like a grant application or an IRB submission, but not necessarily for the purposes of making a decision about research participation. Informed consent inherently acknowledges the person, right? It underscores that participants are partners in research and not merely a means to another person's ends. So informed consent that is effective is going to satisfy the ethical principle of respect for persons, as well as the regulatory requirements of the common rule. Okay, so now let's take a look at some practical tips and some examples to make better sense of everything that we've just covered. Now, we talked quite a bit about key information, but the most common question that we get is, well, okay, fine, that's great, key information, but how do I figure out what's key? Well, key information, like I said earlier, is going to vary with the details. It's going to vary with the context, and it's going to vary with the content of the study. It's also going to depend on the population that you are intending to participate in your research. So now that you know that, how do you figure out what's key? Well, if you are an investigator, you can consider your prior experience with similar populations and seek their input. Or you can seek input from patient advocacy groups, community organizations, or other entities and associations that are going to be reflective of the community you intend to involve in your research. Because again, it's information that is relevant for the intended research participant. In many ways, this level of customization that key information requires underscores your respect for persons because you are going to be communicating information that is relevant to the intended research population specifically. So to figure out what's key, you need to invest the time and you need to understand who your potential participants might be and why they might be interested in your research. And of course, again, what's key information for one study may not be key information for another. The details of the research are going to dictate what information is most likely to assist a prospective participant or their legally authorized representative in understanding the reasons for why they might or might not want to participate in the research. So what could key information look like? Well, again, it's going to largely depend on the research and your intended research population. But in theory, it could look like the example that you see on the screen before you. You can use graphics, you can use clear section headings, and you can ask questions that address the participant. Now, the information that you provide in this case is going to be centered on why the research is being done, what volunteers need to do, and what participation will mean to them. Now, as you read through this text, you'll also notice the organization, the way that the text is organized on paper. You'll note the plain and the casual tone that's used in addressing the participant. And you'll notice the formatting. Now, all of these things are quite essential, both to the key information and to the consent form on the whole. And let's look at that more deeply. Okay, so let's for a moment stop and think back on the ethical principles of the Belmont Report and the regulatory requirements of the Common Rule. Thinking back about that, you'll recall that the information in our consent documents needs to be organized and presented in a way that facilitates understanding in our intended research participants. So knowing that we need to think about organization, how can we create a logical narrative, make sections meaningful, and otherwise organize our information for our intended reader? Well, let's start by acknowledging that practically nobody reads anything that is too long to read, right? TLDR is an acronym for a reason. People skim. I am the very first to admit that I personally skim everything and anything because I am both impatient to a fault and also busy, and I never read anything from start to finish. So if you know that about me, your potential prospective research participant, and you know that attention spans in general are short, how do you grab and keep attention? Well, potential participants are likely to only read what they think is relevant to them, right? We're all looking for the information that is going to apply to us, and we're all sorting out all the other details that we know likely do not. So if you know that about your prospective reader, you need to organize the information in a way that explains how the information is relevant to them. Now, we're already going to start the document off with the critical information that a prospective participant needs to make their decision. This is our key information, but how do you organize things from there? You could apply the same principles to the rest of the document that you do to the key information. So, for example, if you want to describe a process, you describe it in a logical way by demonstrating the steps. You can organize information in a chronological fashion or provide it in the order in which you think participants might ask questions about the study. In essence, you need to develop a logical narrative. Now, what questions might those that are invited to participate in research have? Well, again, they can ask why researchers are doing the research and what they're trying to learn. They might ask why this research matters to them, why they specifically are being asked to participate, what it means if they agree to participate, what they'll need to do, why they might want to participate, why they might not want to participate, what their options are if they decide not to, and so on. Again, the details are going to depend on the study because different studies are going to inspire different questions in prospective participants. This also means that you should use section headings that tell your readers exactly what information is under that section. Now, these section headings guide the reader and explain the function of the different parts of the document. Now, the questions we just considered could be such headings if they are applicable to the research at hand. And as you write the information within each section, you need to arrange your sentences logically with each idea related to or building off the previous one. And you also need to try to confine each paragraph to only one topic or one idea. What about the words? What about the words that go into writing this document? How do you convey things clearly and concisely? Now, of course, it goes without saying that words matter. How you choose your words will dictate the degree to which your language is clear. The words you choose can also help avoid confusion. So you need to be intentional about your words, which is to say that you need to keep in mind their intended meaning of the words that you've selected. Now, we talked quite a bit about the participants' context, and this means that we also need to think about words in their common usage versus the medical jargon, and we need to be very careful to use words that reflect the audience's context. This also means using language your prospective participant is likely to understand and explaining concepts clearly and in simple terms. So an example of this would be swapping a scientific or a medical term with a simpler everyday word. So for example, instead of saying neurocognitive, you could just say brain instead. Instead of using the word randomize, you could just say put into a group by chance instead. You also need to avoid words that have multiple meanings that might that may cause confusion. So for example, bi-weekly can mean twice a week, or it can mean once every 2 weeks. And depending on how this is understood, that may have a significant impact on someone's decision to participate in your research, because that's a question of time commitment to the research. Now, once you've carefully chosen your words, you also need to think about the way that they fit into sentences. Sentence structure really matters. A clunky sentence or a sentence that is too long or that is poorly organized can also create problems for your audience. So in writing your sentences, you need to try to avoid passive voice and use active voice. Now, active voice casts the doer of the action as the subject of the sentence. Passive voice, on the other hand, hides who is responsible. So I'll give you an example. In passive voice, you would say, the sample will be collected. In active voice, in contrast, you would say, a study team nurse will collect your sample. Active voice also avoids long-winded sentences that might otherwise confuse the reader. You also need to be careful not to hide verbs by turning them into nouns. So if you need to describe specimen collection, instead of saying the collection of the specimen is critical to the study for people experiencing XYZ, you could instead say the researchers need to collect your blood to study XYZ. Throughout your consent document, you also need to stick to the same term for the same concept. So if you're going to be describing a survey, stick to the word survey, rather than also refer to it as a questionnaire, a screening tool, or whatever other word you can think of. If a survey is a survey, refer to it as a survey throughout the entire document. Finally, use as few abbreviations and acronyms as you can, because abbreviations and acronyms are confusing and they're overwhelming and they're very difficult to keep track of. Now, what about formatting? What role can formatting play in facilitating comprehension? Formatting is there to help your readers navigate the document visually. No one wants to give a prospective research participant a 30-page consent form when everything could just as easily be included in 20 pages. We all recognize that. But the answer to that isn't to squeeze as much content as possible into each page. You need to space things apart to help the reader clearly see the information on the page before them. That's to say that you need to use proper margins, you need to use white space, average font size, and you need to avoid lengthy and dense blocks of text. The other thing that people do that I think they think they're doing for the purposes of facilitating comprehension, but that actually accomplishes the opposite, is using long lists and bolding and italicizing things just to do it. If you're going to use lists and emphasize text, they should help the reader identify important information, which is to say that when you misuse them, you actually accomplish the opposite effect in that you obscure or you make it difficult to notice what information is of importance. The other thing to bear in mind is visual hierarchy, which refers to the way that readers look at a document and determine the relative importance of the information on the page. This is also the way that readers recognize the relationship between information. Now, the F pattern research shows represents the most common visual hierarchical pattern for English text. Most people are going to follow this pattern unconsciously as they read. This means that the eye naturally skips over things that don't look meaningful. So you need to organize your content into short, clear sections that replicate the F shape on paper. You can also use short headings to draw the eye and indicate each section's purpose. And this way you will improve the odds that your audience is going to identify the content as meaningful to them. Now, you also need to be mindful of the way that you use large text and bright colors. If you want something to pop, you need to contrast it with its surroundings. Text bolding or size should be used strategically to highlight the important information, not to highlight the entire section. You also need to let your text breathe with white space. Graphics such as diagrams, illustrations, and tables, these all add interest. They highlight important information and they group related information together. They're your friends, you should use them. And some concepts, like let's say descriptions of percentages, they're hard to read in a written paragraph, and they may be easier to communicate visually, so long as those visuals are clear, simple, and easy to understand. You should also use color in your graphics. Don't shy away from that, but be mindful of accessibility considerations. Now, there are an estimated 300 million people in the world with color vision deficiency or color blindness. So you need to think about accessibility when you are introducing color to your consent documents. Pictures, of course, can also be useful and meaningful and easy to understand. So, for example, if you need to describe an MRI machine, providing a picture of what it actually looks like might be easier than writing an entire paragraph to describe the machine and its functions. What about the actual process of informed consent? Well, the informed consent document can guide your interactions and conversations with prospective research participants. The document can essentially be a roadmap for your conversations. And as you're following the map, you should also be sure to ask questions to assess your prospective participants' knowledge, their experience, their frame of mind, the extent to which they understand the health information, what might be their motives for participation, the things that they value and how that might dictate what matters to them, and what information about the research might be of importance to them to know in light of those values and considerations. All of this is to say that you need to actively listen to your prospective participants and get to know them, both before and during and after the informed consent process. Now, an easy to understand language, using short words, short sentences, avoiding jargons and acronyms, speaking slowly, and being very specific in what you say and how you say it is also a way of facilitating comprehension and ensuring that the information you are sharing is going to be understood. Using examples to explain things that might be complex or that require additional explanation might also be helpful. If you need practice, you can engage in conversations with colleagues or others in your life who might not otherwise be familiar with research and research participation. And after the study is over, again, this is a question of staying connected to your research participants. Get feedback. What did the participants wish you had told them during the consent process? What information were they especially happy to have? What did they not need to know that you spent 30 minutes explaining in the consent form? All this feedback can inform your future research and what you put in your key information section and in your consent document more broadly. Above everything else, keep in mind that research requires the use of another human being. Ethical research, or research that respects persons and does not reduce them to a mere means, aims to ensure that research participation is informed and voluntary. This puts the concept of informed consent, the physical informed consent document, the process of seeking the informed consent from your prospective research participants, in positions of significant importance. And it also requires us to be thoughtful, to be considerate, and serious about our responsibility to protect and promote the personal autonomy of our research participants. Okay, so very quickly, I just want to take a look at some resources that might be helpful to you. There are a lot of really helpful videos on informed consent on the OHRP website. And this includes both prior presentations that we've given on this topic, as well as presentations and lectures from leaders in the field of human research protections. The links for both of these are provided on this slide. Now, if you're looking for help communicating with prospective participants, I very strongly encourage you to check out our About Research Participation page and use the materials that we've developed to educate the general public about research and research participation. Now, this includes both a printable list of questions to ask when considering an invitation to participate in research, as well as a plain language video that explains the informed consent process in an incredibly clear and accessible way. And I will note this because this is quite important and I think helpful to many of you. All of the ARP resources that we have available on this page are also available in Spanish. Now, if you're looking for regulatory guidance, you can find it at the links provided on this slide. And this includes both formal guidance documents as well as FAQs about informed consent requirements. Last, but certainly not least, I want to mention our upcoming Research Community Forum in Knoxville, Tennessee. Now, if you haven't done so already, please run to register for this in-person two-day event because registration will be closing quite imminently. And if you can't attend that, I also encourage you to save the date for our upcoming RCF in Michigan this September. Finally, both the slides and a recording of this webinar will be available on our website in due time. Please be patient with us. We have to clear these through compliance to ensure that they are accessible. So please check out the past events page for both the slides and the recording of this webinar at a future date. And with that, I thank you and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, Mariana. That was very informative. As she just said, for the attendees, please do put your questions in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them. We have about 10 minutes here. Anything that we can't answer today, we'll try to answer shortly in the future and get back to you. So we do have a few questions, Mariana. The very first one, who can serve as a legally authorized representative? For example, should it be a healthcare proxy or someone with power of attorney?
So, and you and I knew that this question would come up. It depends on the state. So there are state requirements pertaining to who can and cannot serve as a legally authorized representative. So you need to check the state requirements or other jurisdictional requirements to make that determination.
It's a good, and just to follow up, it is a good idea to check with your IRB, and they may have access to legal counsel who can advise you on the local requirements as well. Thank you, Mariana.
This is Yvonne. Just want to add to that. There is actually a legal definition. Well, there is actually a definition of legally authorized representative in the common rule under 102. So do look at that also.
Thank you, Yvonne. Next question, regarding additional elements of consent, I think this is interesting. Is there ever any reason not to include the participant number for minimal risk studies? In other words, when is it ever not appropriate to include that number?
So remember that the additional elements apply if they are applicable to the study. And largely it's again for the purposes of making an informed decision about participation. So for a minimal risk study, it may not be applicable to include the anticipated number of participants. I've seen my share of social and behavioral studies where I can't imagine that it would make a difference to a prospective participant to know whether 30 or 300 participants are intended as the anticipated enrollment number for that study. On the other hand, if you're thinking about a clinical trial, let's say a drug trial, it may indeed be relevant to you to know that the anticipated number of participants may only be 5 versus 500. So it's a consideration that's specific to the study details and whether having that information is necessary for the potential subject to make an informed decision about their participation. Michael, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's a great response. As you saw throughout the presentation, context is incredibly important, and you want to put yourself in the shoes of the would-be participant and see if that's something that you'd want to go about getting waived. So we have a question regarding signature. Does the participant's signature need to be the same? For example, if a participant signs the original consent as Mr. XXAA, but signs a subsequent version as XXHH. Would this have any effect, Mariana?
So I can't imagine that it would have an effect from the perspective of the common rule regulatory requirements. I can imagine for compliance purposes, conducting an audit and ensuring that the same participant signed the same consent form for the same study, for the same participation in the same study, that might have that might be something to consider, just being able to demonstrate that this is the same participant participating under, let's say, 2 different names. But from a regulatory perspective, I can't imagine that that's something that we would address directly. Yvonne, Michael?
It
Yeah,
does. Oh, Yvonne has her
has,
hand up.
go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to clarify here that we are actually talking about the regulatory requirements under the common rule. Be very careful with that because, of course, there's a lot of studies that are also regulated by the FDA. under clinical investigations. And the FDA may have very specific requirements about these. So we're not talking about what the FDA requires. We are only talking about what under the common rule at 45 CFR 46 Part A, subpart A, that for compliance purposes, what we would require. And under the common rule, there isn't really any sort of requirement about people having to sign in the same way using, I mean, I personally have different forms of my signature, like a long form, more formal ones, and a very, short initial one. And as long as it's me who sign it, I think that's what you need to be focusing on.
And my signature is just chicken scratch, so you can never tell that it's me signing two separate documents.
And I would just add on, this seems like it might be, if I understand you correctly, Mariana, a note to file situation to just kind of possibly document that it is indeed the same person, but the signature varied slightly.
That's right. Yep.
So here's a question. Can you provide an example of a procedure that would not normally require consent? Is there guidance about this, I guess, on our website? So I think possibly the asker wanted to know when it might be appropriate to waive consent, if I can paraphrase, if there's some situations that you could talk about like
To
that.
waive consent or to waive documentation of consent?
Well, please talk about both.
So the kind of procedures for which you would waive consent, you had the criteria in front of you. It is not uncommon for studies that utilize, for example, deception to initially request an outright or a partial waiver of informed consent, and then ultimately disclose to the participants after the fact that they were participants in research. That's one common example in which you would seek a waiver of consent. Seeking a waiver of documentation of consent, it is not uncommon in minimal risk social and behavioral studies to seek a waiver of documentation of consent. So for example, if you are conducting a study that is limited to, let's say, interviews with adult participants, an interview is not necessarily something that outside of the context of research would require you to have a signature of consent on a formal document. And so those are the type of procedures for which you might otherwise seek a waiver of documentation of consent. Now, I'm drawing a distinction because I think quite often it is missed that there is a difference between seeking an outright waiver of informed consent and seeking a waiver of documentation of consent. In one case, you are seeking not to get the consent of the prospective research participant. In the other, you are seeking a waiver of the legally required act of them signing the consent document.
Thank you. And I do believe that answered a couple other questions that we have here. So here we have a question pertaining to the regulatory requirements. Does subject signature on consent need to be witnessed? How do you witness e-consent? John asks. And does signature of subject and consenter need to be done at the same time? Can the subject review and sign, and then consenter confirm understanding and answer questions at a later date?
So there are actually quite a number of nuances to that, and I invite Yvonne to weigh in on this if she would like to. With respect to witnesses, there are several considerations, and we do have some guidance on this topic. I actually encourage you to send us an email with a specific case so we can give you an explicit response relevant to that case. But Yvonne, did you want to weigh in on the question of witnesses? And if you are speaking, you are muted.
I guess not. Yeah.
Okay.
So let's see. We probably have time for about one more question, maybe two. Mariana, given the a TLDR, the too long didn't read dynamics, listing individual study activities and the time investment are important. In addition, including the overall time investment may influence or contribute to informed participant decision-making. The questioner has noticed and experienced institutional resistance to stating overall time investments in consent documents. What are your thoughts on this matter, and perhaps do you have any helpful tips to offer?
So I just want to clarify. So the institutional resistance is to notifying the subjects of the time that it will take them to participate in the research. Is that right, Michael?
It sounds as to stating overall time investments in consent documents. So perhaps stating that this will be 5 hours a week for the next 3 months or something along those lines, as I
Yeah.
interpret it.
Yeah, I mean, I would be very curious to hear the explanation for the institutional resistance to sharing this kind of information. I can tell you, if I were in the shoes of a potential participant, I would very much need and want to know what my
Mhm.
personal commitment to the research might be. But Yvonne, I see you have your hand up if you want to chime in.
I just want to remind people also that it is actually a common rule informed consent requirement under 1161, a statement that the study involves research and explanation of the purposes of the research and the expected duration of the subject's participation. So one way or another, there is an expectation that you do tell people about time involvement. Of course, what we may be saying here is a little bit more extensive. For example, you might want to give them a bit more detail about, things like how many hours you need to spend if you come to the clinic for the research visit and so on. Whereas, the common rule requirement, there is more like a general broad expected duration of the entire research. But one way or another, I think, giving people the relevant information as appropriate would really help with recruitment too, right? I mean, you don't want people to, say they'll participate, sign the agreement, and then later on find out that, oh, wow, in fact, the time burden on them is significant. And all they do is just drop out and you lose a participant, wasted all that effort with your recruitment effort. So, I think one way or another, it just is a good idea to be transparent upfront.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Yvonne. Thank you. And with that, we're at time, Mariana. Thank you again for this great presentation. Do you have any closing remarks for us?
No, I thank you all for attending. And again, if you have very specific questions that you didn't have a chance to put in the chat, please feel free to email us at ohrp@hhs.gov. And for those questions that we could not address during the Q&A, we will try to get back to you with a response via email. Thank you all for attending. Again, please be on the lookout for the slides and for a recording of this webinar, as well as the ones that we presented in the prior weeks on our past events page.
Have a good day.
Thanks all.